Um, so welcome to Critical Tech Talk 5. I'm super excited. These speakers we met last week and they came early today and they have a lot to say and it's super interesting. I wish we could have invited you to all of those discussions. Before we get to that, I do have some preliminaries. I hope it's not too long. We have an introduction and I want to get some thank yous out of the way first of all before we get into things. So first thing I want to do is thank the Office of Research for funding the Critical Tech Talk series. I also want to thank all 6 faculties at the University of Waterloo. I think it's great to see that every faculty on campus has endorsed this speaker series that demonstrates a great commitment to responsible innovation, among other things. I also want to thank Communitech, which is where we're located right now, where the Critical Media Lab is located. They've also helped fund this. And I want to thank Wendy Philpott and the Faculty of Arts for setting up this Critical Tech Talk website, and Elena Hines and Sabrina McAllister at Communitech for their assistance with promotion. And finally, Alexi Orchard, who's running the whole show right now and has been very instrumental in getting these events planned and off the ground. So I mentioned that all 6 faculties support the Critical Tech Talk series, and I've invited each time the dean of that faculty to say a few words beforehand. So in this case, it's Dean Lily Liu of the Faculty of Health, and I'm going to share my screen, and Dean Liu has actually recorded some opening statements, which I think are quite lovely, and a land acknowledgement. So I will share my screen now and hand it over to Dean Liu.
Good evening. My name is Lily Liu, and as Dean of the Faculty of Health, I am pleased to provide the land acknowledgement and some introductory remarks. The University of Waterloo acknowledges that our work takes place on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our main campus is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land granted to the 6 nations that include 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. Our active work toward reconciliation takes place across our campuses through research, learning, teaching, and community building, and is coordinated by our Office of Indigenous Relations. Last February, we invited Elder Mayingan Henry to join the Faculty of Health as our Indigenous Knowledge Keeper. On June 20th, 2022, on behalf of the Faculty of Health, I made a commitment with Elder Henry, who represented the Indigenous community, to uphold the commitments made in the response to the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. President Vivek Goel acknowledged the university's full commitment to reconciliation, indigenization, and decolonization through a formal ceremony on September 22nd, 2022. I would like to extend a special welcome to our speakers, Claire Horn, Killam Postdoctoral Research Fellow from Dalhousie University's Health Law Institute, Alana Cattapan, CRC Research Chair in the Politics of Reproduction and Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science, and Margaret Mutumba, a PhD candidate in the School of Public Health Sciences at the University of Waterloo. Our moderator is Marcel O'Gorman, professor in the English department. Critical Tech Talk is produced by the Critical Media Lab at the University of Waterloo. This series is sponsored by Communitech, the Office of Research, and each of the 6 faculties. This is the 5th in the series and is fitting that this talk is co-hosted by the Faculty of Health. Today's topic by Dr. Claire Horn, titled Artificial Wombs, the Disobedient Future of Birth, is certainly going to generate an uncomfortable dialogue around ectogenesis or artificial wombs. This dialogue challenges us to adhere to an ethos of responsible innovation or tech for good, which is the purpose of each Critical Tech Talk. About 16% or 1 in 6 couples in Canada experience infertility. This prevalence increases to 1 in 4 couples in developing countries. Artificial womb technology promises to provide an opportunity for women who do not have a uterus to bear children. Conventional treatments for infertility is currently inconsistently accessible across Canada, highlighting the inequities across socioeconomic status and other indicators. This divide would only widen with the introduction of expensive innovations such as artificial wombs. A more unsettling thought is the current promotion of artificial wombs, not as a health intervention, but as a social intervention to address perceived inequities such as biases and discrimination. For example, one can find on social media quotes like, "Artificial wombs allow the birth of a child without risking the potential health and career hazards that come with being pregnant. They can also help a woman compete on a more level playing field in a sexist world that discriminates against pregnant women." Like all new innovations, just because we can do it, the question is, should we? And if yes, under what conditions? What regulations are needed to be in place to ensure that we use technology responsibly? I anticipate this evening's discussion will stretch us beyond our comfort zones and push us to reflect on our values as we question not what the technology can do, but how we as a society can use this technology for good.
Sorry, it was great. It was a great introduction. Thank you, Dr. Liu, for that. You saved me some work actually with my introductions. Before we begin though, I'm sorry, I just want to add one thing and then I'll shut up. This talk was inspired in part, I hate to say it, by a Twitter exchange between Elon Musk, Gumroad founder Sahil Lavingia, and Ethereum co-founder Vitalik Buterin, who happens to be University of Waterloo alumnus. In the exchange, the three founders muse over the possibility of synthetic wombs as a way to liberate women from childbirth, allow them to contribute more fully to the workforce, and ease the problem of an underpopulated world. I won't comment on this at length, but I would say that it also speaks to the opening of Dr. Liu's statement about colonialism. And I don't want to trivialize the notion of colonialism or the land acknowledgement that she gave, but the concept of tech colonialism speaks to the idea that big tech quite consciously draws on the function of colonial power to appropriate and exploit everything from outer space to minerals in the earth to private data, and yes, possibly even the human uterus if given the opportunity. So as much as I want to ignore that Twitter conversation, I think it's important to acknowledge what's at stake in it. And anyway, you're not here to listen to me or listen to me rant. I want to introduce our esteemed speaker, who, unlike me, is an expert on this topic. So Dr. Claire Horn, as you have heard, is a Killam postdoctoral research fellow at Dalhousie in the Health Law Institute. She's previously held research fellowships at the Wellcome Trust and Modern Law Review. Her work over the last 6 years has focused on law and policy governing sexual and reproductive health, rights, and technologies with specific interest in ectogenesis. And note, her book, Eve, The Disobedient Future of Birth, just came out in the UK last week. I think that's right, Claire. And I understand that the book will be available in Canada in September of this year. So I'm going to stop talking now and hand things over to Dr. Claire Horn. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcel. I feel like I have all of this pre-buzz starting out the talk with Elon Musk as a specter over us. I'm going to just move into screen share and then I'll get started. Okay, so before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I am actually speaking to you from Mi'kmaq, which is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, who are the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. I want to thank Marcel and Alexi for organizing, and Margaret and Alana for being here as respondents. What I really want to do, and I think that we've kind of had the stage set for this already, is just to provide us with some grounds for a broader discussion about artificial wombs and about reproductive technologies more broadly. So I'm actually currently on parental leave. I wrote my book, Eve, while pregnant with my first child, and they happened to kind of arrive about the same time. But I'm glad to be able to dip back into this work as my book, like Marcel said, was published about a week ago in the UK. So I'm hoping to speak for just about 20 minutes, and with an eye on the time, what I thought I'd do is give you a bit of an overview of artificial womb technology, and then kind of the Coles Notes version of my book. And then I want to get into a specific example that I'm really interested in. So when people hear ectogenesis, external gestation, or artificial womb, I think it's extremely easy and very compelling to kind of leap into speculating on dystopian or utopian possibilities for this technology. What Eve is really about is arguing that artificial wombs, of course, are neither fundamentally good or bad on their own. They'll be shaped by the social context into which they arrive. So it's about kind of grounding the technology within the existing limitations of the world we live in today. So like I said, to round out the talk, I'm going to get into one example, and specifically the implications of artificial wombs within the context of contemporary health inequity, specifically for pregnant people and preterm babies. And then I just want to really open up the question of how we could reframe our discussion of artificial wombs and their development by taking an approach to this technology that's informed by justice. Okay, what am I doing here? So prematurity remains the leading cause of death globally for children under the age of 5. And in a well-resourced, wealthy hospital today, the point at which an extremely preterm baby stands a chance of survival sits around 23 to 24 weeks. But before 28 weeks, morbidity remains extremely high simply because these preterm babies, their organs have not yet sufficiently developed to be able to survive in the outside world. In 2017, research groups based in the US and working across Australia and Japan, respectively, created platforms in which they gestated lamb fetuses from the equivalent of approximately 23 weeks in a human for 4 weeks in an artificial womb, bridging this really important developmental period. These technologies work by replicating the environment of the uterus. So they submerge the fetus in continually circulated artificial amniotic fluid that is pumped by the fetus's own heartbeat, and they're paired with an artificial placenta that delivers nutrients and flushes toxins. And there's differences in these platforms, which have been called Extend and Eve. We can talk about that more in our discussion, but they share a similar approach. And there's also a group now working in the Netherlands, and I believe there's a team working at Sick Kids in Toronto too. So what makes these technologies really distinct from existing forms of neonatal care is that the technology that we currently have, it acts as an emergency intervention to redress the complications of preterm birth. But the intention of these technologies is to effectively prevent those complications from arising to begin with by allowing the fetus to continue to develop as though it had not yet been born. So the immediate goal of these technologies is to act as a form of emergency life supports, so to extend the developmental period into the point where the preterm baby has a better chance of survival and health outcomes. And there's been successful animal trials of this technology, and I believe each group is hoping to move to clinical trials with humans within the next 5 to 10 years. As a kind of sidebar, one of the research teams actually recently released a paper looking at how they might manage birth or movement from the pregnant person's body into the technology without the fetus ever physiologically becoming a baby, meaning moving it from the pregnant person's body into the tech without ever breathing air. So I think there's a whole slew of ethical questions around consent that we might want to dip into there as well. Concurrently with this work in neonatology, there's been research in embryology over the last several years towards the cultivation of embryos outside the body. So 2 research teams at Rockefeller and Cambridge University were able to successfully grow embryos up to 13 days. And this was quite significant because prior to this point, it was believed that embryos would need input from a maternal body to continue to develop at around 7 days. So this showed that the embryos could actually self-organize in the absence of maternal tissues. This research only stopped due to what's called the 14-day limit. This is a strict law or research guideline in a number of countries, but it's actually in the process of revision in some places. And Alana, maybe you can talk about that a little bit after as well. More recently, 2 groups based in Israel and the UK, respectively, were able to grow mice from embryos into fetuses with fully formed organs using a mechanical artificial womb. So this was quite remarkable. This is the first time that mammals have been externally gestated in this way. And the scientists hope to take the mice to full term and eventually replicate the experiment with human embryos if they are able to get ethical approval. So there's much discussion in the social scientific literature about whether these forms of research will one day meet in the middle and will have achieved what's called full ectogenesis. So that would be the gestation of a baby in an artificial womb from the stage of embryo implantation through to removal from the artificial womb. There are significant scientific and regulatory barriers to this, and I delve into all of these in pretty substantive detail. I think there is a really important question here about whether this actually is possible. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm interested in both full ectogenesis, but I also want to sort of offer a focus on some of the ethical questions surrounding artificial wombs as neonatal technology. So I wrote Eve because, as I think many of us here know, scientific research often moves faster than cultural conversations. And so I think now is the right time to have a public dialogue about the implications of ectogenesis for parenthood, for human and reproductive rights, for health inequality, among many other ethical issues. These technologies really pose a breadth of legal, social, and ethical questions. And as I mentioned before, I think time and time again with these kinds of promissory technologies and development, we tend to go down a path of imagining extremes, these utopian or dystopian scenarios. And in Eve, I really tried to bring it back to looking at the contemporary limitations of the world we live in today. So looking at specific legal contexts in specific countries, for instance, to kind of think about what the actual implications of these artificial womb technologies are. So I want to turn to a brief example and offer some questions that I hope will be generative for us kind of leaping into our discussion. So I want to talk about artificial wombs in the context of contemporary health inequality. The scientists that are working on neonatal technologies like Eve and Extend, they intend them to alleviate the very real harms of extremely preterm birth. So again, these technologies could prevent complications from arising potentially as early as 21 weeks gestation. So that's just past the halfway point of a full-term human pregnancy. And this is actually quite remarkable. And there may also be uses in the care of pregnant people. So for instance, delivering treatments to a preterm baby, to a fetus, without exposing the pregnant person to harmful substances, or further down the line for use where health issues in the later stages of pregnancy pose a danger to the pregnant person. Again, there are issues of consent that we can think and talk about here. But from well before the current developments, social scientists have really extolled artificial wombs as revolutionary for the potential to ease the dangers of pregnancy, which can include life-threatening conditions like preeclampsia. And there's also a framing in the feminist literature in particular of artificial wombs as a potential new reproductive choice. And in this framing, there's often a discussion of this choice occurring initially for health reasons, and then potentially further down the line as an alternative means of reproduction. I think these ideas are compelling, they're interesting, but this framing really needs to be grounded in contemporary structural context. So first of all, the reality is that these platforms in progress are costly, they're labor intensive, they require expert training, and they're really designed for limited uses in the most well-equipped neonatal intensive care units. Each patented piece of this biotechnology is going to be very pricey. And there are stakeholders already across numerous companies with collaborations across computer programming, engineering, and biotechnology more broadly. And then the social conditions into which this technology arrives are starkly inequitable, and they are that way specifically for the groups that external gestation is intended to benefit, so pregnant people and preterm babies. According to the World Health Organization, 94% of perinatal deaths globally occur in low and lower medium income countries, and infants in these regions are significantly more likely to be born preterm. 90% of extremely preterm babies that are born in low income countries die in the first few days of life, compared to 10% in high income countries. As of 2022, the World Health Organization reports that in low income settings, half of all babies born at or below 32 weeks, which is significantly further along than these technologies are targeted at, die due to a lack of feasible, cost-effective care such as warmth, breastfeeding support, and basic care for infections and breathing difficulties. In high-income countries, almost all of these babies survive. And of course, these disparities are not down to a lack of technology. This is down to an inequitable distribution of low-cost resources like antibiotics, steroids, and safe, culturally sensitive, and appropriate midwifery care. Within wealthy nations, despite the broader availability of these resources that I've mentioned, racialized inequity in outcomes for babies and pregnant people is stark. So in Canada, Black and Indigenous women are more at risk of having preterm and stillborn babies, and Indigenous women are more at risk of death and complications during the perinatal period. And the limited data that we have suggests that this is also true for Black mothers in Canada. These kinds of racialized inequities in the rates of preterm births and complications from these births, as well as the perinatal outcomes, map across other wealthy nations like Australia, the US, and the United Kingdom. So for instance, in the UK, the rates of preterm birth and complications for Black women and their babies are in fact increasing. These problems are down to issues including structural racism, biased and insufficient care, the legacy of colonialism, as I believe Marcel mentioned, and inequitable distribution of birth centers and resources. So even as we see artificial wombs celebrated in the humanities literature as a game changer, we really need to ask the question, for who? So there's no current reason to believe that technologies in development are going to do anything other than really increase existing stratification or leave it as it is. The idea that ectogenesis, and this is a quote from Takala, would not only free women from pregnancy and provide an additional choice in care, but also potentially eventually lead to true equality that comes up in much of the literature, it's challenged by the stratifications that currently exist in reproductive care. So to put it very simply, technology doesn't solve social problems. So if you introduce it without having touched the social causes of inequity, you leave those disparities unaddressed. And I think there's very real questions to ask here about whether we should be creating these technologies at all, right? So the physician and the founder of the US-based National Birth Equity Collaborative, Dr. Joya Kriya-Perry, notes that a consistent problem that perpetuates inequity in reproductive health is investment in biotechnologies rather than people. So for instance, investing in these kinds of technologies like artificial wombs over, for instance, programming to train and support midwives, opening birth centers in places with little access, support for traditional birth practices within communities, and measures to understand the causes and reduce preterm birth rates in the first instance. And just to, as much as I hate to go back to Elon Musk, we can flag here that if Musk and his buddies, for lack of a better term, genuinely cared about women, then they would invest in all of these kinds of issues. They would put their billions into these issues, the research that's already occurring on the ground, rather than speculating about artificial wombs. But research towards artificial womb platforms is already occurring. So it's already been granted quite significant funding in a number of wealthy nations. And this is the context that it's taking place in. So these inequalities exist and the research has been funded. So with that sort of acknowledged, I want to close out with just framing how we might have a different kind of conversation about artificial wombs. And I hope this can sort of push us into our discussion. So the position that I take in Eve is that the precondition for a future in which we could actually use artificial wombs in compelling, progressive, or feminist ways is a world grounded in reproductive justice. And I think we can also have a chat about what constitutes a progressive use of this technology, right? And I don't think that the pursuit of artificial wombs as a means of redressing very real risks to pregnant people and preterm babies is not a worthy pursuit. And I think emerging projects that consider the artificial womb as a way to improve reproductive health choices within a different context, I think that those ideas, again, are compelling. But I think this is about emphasizing that this technology is likely to enter a context of substantive inequity. And I think that by acknowledging that, we can reframe questions about how the technology could be designed, adapted, introduced, and regulated. I'm informed by a reproductive justice framework when I'm thinking about considering this technologies against contemporary realities. And just as an explainer, reproductive justice is a grassroots initiative founded by Black women in the United States. The sister song, Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, defines the framework as, quote, the complete physical, mental, spiritual, political, social, and economic well-being of women and girls based on the full achievement and protection of human rights. The framework emphasizes the importance of, quote, fighting equally for the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to parent the children we have, as well as to control our birthing options, and the enabling conditions to realize these rights. Loretta Ross, who is one of the founders of the movement, notes that for reproductive care to be granted, so for these necessary enabling conditions to occur, people have to be provided with the resources to experience care in a way that is safe, affordable, accessible, and acceptable to them. So being informed by this framework, to me, in this specific context of this technology, means situating discussions of reproductive technologies within their social context and understanding the ways that race, class, gender, global location, immigration status, sexuality, among other aspects of people's identities and experiences, shape access to and quality of reproductive care. So understanding how a person's ability to act on reproductive choices is really shaped by the conditions in their community and by social, structural, and institutional factors. And I think engaging a framework that's informed by reproductive justice to consider the artificial womb is a way to compel us to look beyond a focus on whether the technology could act as, this is a quote from Evie Kendall, a new reproductive alternative. It requires us to ask who might be excluded from the choices that the technology is purported to increase. And the aim here is one of resituating. So what would happen if we grounded an analysis of the technology within a discourse of reproductive justice and freedom, rather than within a discourse of liberal choice? How can we reframe discussions about the implications of artificial wombs? And again, I just want to offer a starting point here for us to kind of explore. So I want to offer a few questions, and I think it's important to emphasize that I don't want to situate myself as the person that should be answering these questions. I just want to put them forward, and maybe we can sort of get into some of them in our discussion, and we can also just leave some of them hanging there too. So firstly, what if justice was foregrounded as these technologies were designed, developed, and implemented? Is it possible to conceive of the future with artificial wombs in a different way? What happens if we were to leave with the question of capacity for safe use in low resource environments? Current research on artificial wombs is happening within wealthy nations. How might collaboration with organizations and practitioners working in low income nations alter the impact of artificial wombs, or could it? What if questions of accessibility, adaptability to spaces outside the NICU, for instance, by midwives, doulas, pregnant people themselves, were raised? What are the materials at issue in artificial womb construction? So where are these materials sourced? What do they cost? Who assembles them? And who has stakes in their use? What infrastructures are required for safe assembly? Who is included as a stakeholder, as someone that has an essential perspective on the development of this technology? Are we talking only engineers and physicians and neonatologists? What about midwives, pregnant people, birth workers? And I think there's also issues we need to really think through with regard to the ethics of trials of this technology and consent to use. I mentioned this briefly, but I think that this is important. And I write about this in Eve as well, but maybe we can weave this into our discussion too. So when we think about the role of regulation, there are uses of this technology that a workable framework in future might promote or might protect against. And I think one of the real key issues here is who is centered in these discussions. So right now, conversations about artificial wombs are very much happening in kind of conservative bioethical spaces and in sort of legal scholarship circles, if you will. And I'm interested in what would happen if questions of how this technology could or should be used and where were formulated not by bioethicists and scientists, but by pregnant people, intending parents of all genders, nurses, doulas, midwives, and again, birth workers within communities. So I realize I just put out a lot of questions. It's kind of my thing, but I hope that it provides us sort of generative fodder to get into a conversation. Thank you. And I have a long slide here with some references. I'll just put it up briefly if anyone wants to take a quick screenshot.
Claire, that was brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much. So much to think about. Yeah, who is the human and human-centered technology? Amazing. So again, I'm just going to quickly reintroduce our two respondents and conversants here, same conversants. Alana Cattapan is a Canada Research Chair in the Politics of Reproduction and Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science, the University of Waterloo. And Margaret Mutumba is a PhD student in Public Health and Health Systems at the University of Waterloo. Margaret also had, I'm going to give them like a minute to talk about their work. So I'm not going to do any more introducing, except to say that Margaret is defending her PhD dissertation this week, which I think is crazy. Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us. So Margaret, why don't we start with you? Just say a few words about your own work so we have some context, and then we'll move on to Alana, who can do the same. Then we'll move into the conversation part. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. Good evening, everyone. Well, my work is centered around infertility or access to fertility services, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. So very much connected to Claire's presentation and just thinking about how that technology has been utilized in those spaces. So my PhD research is on examining access and affordability through a public health lens, which is my background. And I also have a entrepreneurship endeavor through MedAtlas, where we're connecting doctors to specialist healthcare, in particular fertility specialists as well. And that's a little bit about me. Thanks.
Gotta find the unmute button, which I never do. I feel like after years of being on Zoom, I would get the deal. Okay. Hello. I'm Alana. I'm the lead of the Politics of Reproduction research group, also at the University of Waterloo. You can find us at thepoliticsofreproduction.ca. And my work in this role is to examine how law and policy work together to reify inequalities related to the governance and politics of reproduction. So for me, that question is about how do state actions and inactions regulate and govern reproductive decision-making, and who gets seen as potentially reproductive and who's excluded from those conversations. Margaret, did I interrupt you? I feel like you were totally done. I have such trouble on Zoom, like reading people's faces. Okay. So my work right now is centered around a few empirical projects. It's always centered around empirical projects. I'm a social scientist. So I'm in the midst of 3 separate empirical projects right now with people who are left out or not always seen as priorities in decision-making about the use of reproductive technologies in Canada. So that's people who have been surrogates, people who have been egg donors, and people who are freezing their eggs. And our teams are asking about their experiences and factors that inform their decision-making as much as we can in an hour-and-a-half interview or a survey. I'm also part of a large collaboration at the University of Saskatchewan, where I'm an adjunct professor, where we're collaborating with an Indigenous health research group and an organization called Sanctum 1.5, which is a 10-bed pre- and postnatal home with these adorable little babies that supports HIV-positive pregnant women and those at risk of having their infants taken at birth. And so we collaborate in thinking about how women want to make decisions about raising or not raising their babies and making decisions about how to live their lives. And I'll wrap up real quick, Marcel, sorry. There are other projects as well about the concept of reproductive age in my group and how it shapes the decision-making and autonomy of different people, on trans and gender diverse folks' access to care, genetic and genomic governance, on the commercialization of body parts, including reproductive tissues, but we're also looking at blood plasma. And my students are doing incredible work on midwifery, endometriosis, visual depictions of pregnant bodies and abortion, amongst other critical topics. So I'll stop there. And I'm so excited to talk about this work, Claire.
Amazing. I'm gonna ask Margaret to go first. And Claire threw out a bunch of questions, but you probably had your own questions or things that came to mind during the talk or beforehand. So go ahead, Margaret.
Thank you. And yeah, I really appreciated the presentation, and a couple of things came up, but I think one of the questions Claire did pose is whether artificial wombs could be a reality. And what that could look like. I have confidence in the human race, and I do think that that can be a reality. Going back to when, my background obviously is in fertility and IVF, but in the 1970s, when IVF technologies were being developed, a lot of individuals and scholars and researchers critiqued it, but also assumed that it would not be a possibility. And 30 years down the road, here we are. It's part of clinical practice and it's being utilized. So I think it's very much a possibility. And from a public health lens, I think there's a strong argument around communities or countries where they're having a population decline, wanting to pursue this line of reproduction, because it gives you more control over the process. Already we have, I think, in my opinion, over-medicalized the birthing process. And so this is just another step in that direction. You don't have to depend on a woman in this case, or a person with a womb to be able to do that. You can do that excluding all those individuals. And so in a world where power is held amongst a handful of people, what does that look like in terms of equity? Again, to your point, Claire, who's going to be making those decisions? Who is going to be able to afford these sorts of technologies? I will say, for the moment, at least the argument around low income contexts and poor birthing outcomes, especially for preterms, I don't think that argument would be applicable in this case, because this technology and the infrastructure for that to successfully happen does not exist in those low resource contexts, and I don't see it existing for a long time. And so I think that the basis of that argument is already flawed, and maybe thinking about folks who are already financially advantaged and just want to give their preterm babies a better outcome is a more realistic argument to put forward. And those are my initial comments.
Sorry, I was just writing down your comments. Should I respond? No? Yeah. Thank you, Margaret. That is so many really compelling points that you made to think about. I'm just looking at what I've noted down, and I wanted to ask you more about a couple things. Well, first, I think to your point about that kind of potential for engagement within low-income contexts, I think that's a really important point, because certainly, while the artificial womb substantively differs from incubator technology, we can already look at existing technologies and think about these various attempts, right, to have incubators that are more adaptable to low resource settings, but then also the fact that we haven't seen this kind of massive shift in the construction and creation of incubators. And so there is a point there of why would we then expect that artificial wombs could translate. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that. And then I also wanted to ask you to say more, because I completely agree with your point about this existing problem of already over-medicalizing birth. And this is a major concern for me. And I think I mentioned briefly in the talk about some of this discussion of trying to physiologically make sure that the preterm remains in the state of a fetus as opposed to a baby, and how that would kind of work. But could you talk a little bit more about your point, both the point around the sort of the flaw in that idea of the artificial womb in the low income setting, and also a little bit more about the over medicalization of birth.
Absolutely. So the one of course, the biggest issues, and I'm glad you highlighted this, is that many times these technologies are developed in wealthy countries on their own, and then they want to then carry that technology and translate it into a low income context, which is one, very, what's the word, discriminatory. And two, you cannot expect folks to automatically buy into a system that you've established solely from the perspective of a Western context or a wealthy context. That is quite unacceptable. And in my own work through IVF research, I've heard many practitioners, clinicians in the low resource context saying, one, we are not engaged in that process, and two, why do you then want us to adopt it without also considering whatever the societal and contextual issues around that technology are that could be incorporated early on to avoid issues down the road? So if you say, for example, incubators, that's most likely a technology that was not developed in the low resource context. And just using that technology in many hospitals, you have to think about infrastructure challenges like lack of consistent electricity. I mean, for an artificial womb, that's already a dead end. There is no way you're going to be able to sustain that. Number two, hygiene, sanitation, and access to clean water are things that are still very much challenges in those contexts, which this sort of technology would require. But then you also have to realize that in many low resource, and I will speak specifically for African context, is our power structures sometimes are not as democratic. For instance, I'll say for Uganda, for instance, we've had the same president for 32 years now, right? So they are power structures which are monopolized. And so how would this technology be used in context where that control and lack of regulation exists? And automatically, actually, when you were talking, I thought about the genocide in Rwanda and how they wanted to eliminate a whole ethnic group. And so if someone has power with this sort of technology, maybe they can generate a whole ethnic group that they might find desirable. So it's very, very dangerous in contexts where, you know, politics is not practiced fairly or power is not distributed fairly. But also the question around over medicalization, just briefly, I'll touch on the history of birthing in many African contexts is a very intimate cultural practice where before you had midwives, we had traditional birth attendants. And these were normally older women in the community who knew these mothers, who had probably raised them in some way. And it was a very intimate, personal experience. With the medicalization of that birthing process, a woman goes into a health center and is helped through this process by someone she's never met, by someone she doesn't know. So that human connection is lost. And now we're furthering the process by saying, actually, probably you won't even need midwives at this point with this artificial birthing process. You just need a few scientists, a few engineers. So it's further dehumanizing, in my opinion, the experience of birthing and reproduction. I understand the argument for folks who are having preterm or have pre-existing conditions and so on, but there are real unintended consequences that could come out of this technology, and I think it's worth having that discussion.
I just want to say briefly, Margaret, thank you. That was like really, really generative thoughts. And I want to say also to your point about the dangerous ways that this technology could be used. So this is something that I talk a lot about in the book, that we do have, it is not hard to find examples of pregnant people having their control over their bodies taken over, particularly by the state. And so it's something that comes up that has been flagged in the literature before. And you get some of these arguments in some of the bioethical literature that is very dismissive of that idea. That's sort of like, oh, it would never happen. But precisely as you pointed out, it has already happened. It has happened many times. And so why would we not look to the possibility that it could happen and then talk about how we prevent that?
Alana, good time for you to jump in here.
Yeah, I was just unmuting. I keep thinking, Claire, and like as you were talking about the possibility of autonomy being overruled in this case, drawing on what Margaret said, I think about the language of liberation that surrounds this that we mentioned before, that Marcel opened with a little bit. I think about Shulamith Firestone, and of course I had to cover my eyes for some reason to remember her name. But the idea of surrogacy and in vitro fertilization is liberating. And then there was a big, excitement about egg freezing for the same reason, about egg donation, about human nuclear genome transfer, mitochondrial replacement, whatever you want to call it. I was just attending, and Margaret and I were talking about this the other day, the Third International Summit on Human Genome Editing, excitement about in vitro gametogenesis. There are so many technologies that may or may not be possible, but increasingly shape how we think about reproduction. But there is not a great move towards liberation in this kind of language. And, your talk has really made me think about not only how this creates stratification, but the false promises of a new ideal, that if only we can realize another technology, we will be liberated from our repressive bodies and therefore find equality. But we don't hear about things like, addressing, Dean Liu opened with the note of 1 in 6 people being infertile, but we don't talk about addressing sexually transmitted infections that often cause that, delayed parenthood, which may cause that, exposure to environmental toxicants, which can cause that. There are so many ways in which we're offloading the problem to the promises of a future ideal technology in a way that I think you pointed out really beautiful here. So I wanted to point you to sort of 2 things. One is the language of choice, which you mentioned, and the sort of liberal framing of this technology as potentially liberatory in an entirely individual way, which I think your framing of this as a matter of reproductive justice addresses. But I wonder if you could speak more specifically to the language of choice that's often used to talk about reproduction and how it operates here in useful but also insidious ways. Then the other thing I wanted to bring up is something that we've been having an email conversation about. Marcel, you have not seen this, but Margaret and Claire and I have been talking over the last few days about the concept of fetal viability and the way that the potential to move fetal viability backwards 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks might have implications for legal constructions of fetal personhood and laws governing other things, including abortion.
Wow. Yeah. So another question came up for me there for both Margaret and Alana that we can maybe put a pin in, which is that I would love to hear both of your thoughts on how some of these kinds of ideas of the promise of artificial wombs are also wrapped up in discussions of fertility technology. So how you've sort of seen some of those things before. Margaret, I know you touched on it briefly, but I would be really curious to hear more about that. So these two like big meaty questions about choice and the concept of fetal viability. Firstly, on choice, I think that it is just such a consistent problem throughout discussions of reproductive care that this idea that it's simply about providing choices to people, and then we've kind of done enough. This is exactly what has what has caused this kind of mess in many, many places around abortion rights, where abortion is in theory protected by law, but impossible for people to access because the choice is protected by law, but access isn't protected. And it's very easy to just continue to peel away at access to all forms of reproductive care in this way of offering that choice has been protected because the law says that you can choose what kind of care you want, but making access impossible in practice. And I think that also goes back to both these issues that I think are useful to think of in conjunction with this discourse on artificial wombs. So around both access to abortion and to fertility technologies, where I think we all know in the work that we do that, in fact, there is this promise, for instance, around medication abortion and around IVF, that look at all of the ways that this is going to change the world and be so empowering. And then, in fact, all of those ideals are struck down by the fact that choice without access and without context means absolutely nothing. And then to the point about fetal viability, so there's two things that I would touch on. One is that what actually got me into this topic in the first place was that when I was doing my PhD, I came across the term ectogenesis and understood that this research was happening. And then I was just floored by how much of the literature on this topic from legal scholars was vested in making the claim that if artificial womb technology existed, people would no longer be morally permitted or legally permitted to have abortions. And the claim here is basically that abortion is protected because pregnancy occurs in a person's body and therefore their autonomy is affected. However, if it was possible to simply transfer that pregnancy out of their body, thus no longer involving their body in the equation, we would require people to do that instead of seeking termination. And so a lot of my writing has just been me being so angry that this claim gets made and you know, pointing out how regressive and anti-feminist it is, and also how it totally fails to recognize all of the reasons why people would seek abortion, right? Which people shouldn't have to provide a reason for seeking an abortion to begin with. And then the other sort of more, I guess, jarring aspect of this is that the law in many places where abortion is still criminalized, but is permitted under a series of exceptions, the law does bake in fetal viability or personhood as a kind of limitation around the abortion right. So for instance, in the UK, abortion is still criminalized under the Abortion Act. And one of the exceptions under which abortion is permitted is that you can access it prior to fetal viability. And so the danger is that there is this sort of the theoretical claim, but then there's also the legal problem, which is that because we have these limited, insufficient abortion law, there doesn't need to be law on abortion to begin with, right? There is a potential legal challenge that I think we do actually have to be keeping an eye on. And it's not, I think it's also important that it's not a new challenge to abortion rights. It's just another tool in a long-standing challenge to those rights.
Yeah, I think that one of the exchanges we were having was about how many of these technologies could be extremely liberating, extremely helpful, extremely generative in contexts where different family forms are supported, where there is real equality in substantive ways. Like in an ideal world, perhaps we could have this conversation, but the preconditions for that simply are feel so far away. I think I used in our exchange, like impossible to imagine.
I think that actually maybe addresses a couple of the questions that we're getting from attendees. You know, the question about the issue, would artificial wombs impact women's rights to abortion, especially when women choose not to use artificial wombs, and how could ectogenesis be applied by the state, for example, or other sources in that case? And that's a question that someone has asked. And then the other question, just about the problem of the issue of reproductive justice, including a right to ectogenesis as a form of securing safety in childbirth in the future. Maybe that's getting more toward a utopian future where ectogenesis is available to everyone. But I think I just want to address a couple of those questions from the audience. But we don't have to address all of them, and I'm sure you have more to say, so I don't want to interrupt the conversation. One thing that amazed me is that I was just looking up, there's an article from 1995 on cyberfeminism that references ectogenesis, and this discourse fits perfectly along with the rhetoric and discourse of disembodiment in technology, for everything from the internet to virtual reality, praising this idea of transcending the human body. It's like transhumanist way of understanding technology. And nectogenesis, this discussion really brings that down to earth in a very real way. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt. I'm
No,
sure
no,
you
it
have
just
more
feels
to
like
say.
it's not even 90s. I feel like you could, if you kept looking, you'd find stuff from the 70s that's doing that same
And
conversation.
science fiction, as one of a couple of our attendees have pointed out, that there is a history in science fiction about these very ideas as well. So
The
yeah.
20s, it goes so far back.
Yeah. I'm not going to ask questions. I'm sure you have more to say. So if Margaret or Alana, if you have something else you wanted to bring up, please do so.
I just wanted to address maybe the question around it being a viable choice for women with healthcare challenges. And I think we have reiterated in this discussion that it does make sense for people with pre-existing conditions, people with high-risk pregnancies, people who are at risk of, fatalities from carrying a pregnancy. And yes, this technology can support that, and it would be good for that. The issue is its application, I think, is what our discussion is saying here, because that was the same promise with IVF, right? Any woman who's struggling to have a child will have, a couple will have this technology. But the reality on the ground, and I think this is what Claire's book Eve is saying, is that these technologies are not applied universally. And so IVF or surrogacy, for instance, in many African countries, including Uganda, where I'm from, surrogacy is legal. But the cost of IVF in addition to surrogacy is exponential. And so it's only wealthy people that have access, one, to IVF, but two, to surrogacy, because that's an additional cost. And so if we live in a context where it's still capitalist, and, of course, the cost of this treatment is expensive, and only a few have access to it, it means that only a few are going to benefit from that technology, which is the issue we're bringing with the reproductive justice lens, is this really going to be fair? But there was someone here who also asked the question around the reproductive justice lens, including spirituality, especially for people of color. And that work has actually been very close to the kind of work I'm doing, whereby even the current services we're providing in terms of IVF or infertility, it's very much from a biomedical lens. And yet, when you think about it from a contextual or cultural perspective, the ability or the inability to have children has very spiritual implications on different cultures, right? And so in what I've seen, at least in Africa, is that these services are often provided in collaboration with spiritual leaders, especially around the psychological and emotional burden of infertility and treatment. Often the psychologists that will be provided to those patients are in Uganda, because it's a predominantly Christian country, will likely be Christian, but we also work with Tanzania, which is predominantly Muslim. And so the type of support they'll get there is probably going to be attuned to the Muslim culture. So they do incorporate that spiritual element. And I have met clinicians who are actually religious and will share that, our work as clinicians is to do our part and we leave the rest up to God. That's the kind of discourse that you're going to hear in many cultures where spirituality is still very much part and parcel of that culture. Now, this question around artificial wombs in the context of religion is going to obviously be a very contentious issue, because for many religions, birthing is a God-given right. That's how they word it. It's, children are a blessing from God. Think about all the cultural terms that we use normally that will now be, should I say, disintegrated by this artificial womb technology. We are no longer, thinking about this from a spiritual perspective or from a mythical perspective, because now as humans, we're able to do this on our own. And so I think there'll be quite a significant amount of resistance there. I will tell you that for many religious countries, even providing IVF, they'll only provide it to couples who are married. They'll only provide it to relations which are heterosexual. I know in many Muslim countries, they will not accept third-party donation, because for them lineage is very important, and surrogacy, for instance, also so some countries will not accept it. So these technologies are going to be interpreted based on the context, and we cannot control that, right? You cannot develop a technology in the UK and control how South Korea decides to use it. So it's almost like the person who developed the atomic bomb. It was for one reason, but in the end, it was used for such disastrous implications. So that's my contribution.
Brilliant. I want to stay on this topic a little bit, Lana, and you'll probably talk about this, but the three of you are coming from pretty different, you're covering pretty different cultural contexts in your work, which makes it really interesting. And Claire, you've been doing a lot of work in the UK. Alana, you do work specifically, you've done work on the ground in British Columbia and in Saskatchewan, is that right? And Margaret, you just told us about your experience. We have a question here about the United States. The idea of ectogenesis as an alternative to abortion is being fairly widely discussed. So maybe you could say a little bit more, Claire and Alana, about this cultural context and about your experiences with what you've been working in culturally.
Alana, do you want to jump in?
Exactly the same time we unmuted. Yeah, I have some difficulty answering this question. My work has been in Saskatchewan, in Nova Scotia, and in Ontario, not in BC yet. We're starting a new project though. But I'll say the idea of ectogenesis being an alternative to abortion, or like an idea of viability, makes me want to revisit the question of what problem is ectogenesis aiming to solve. Like when we are thinking about any biotechnological innovation, or like as an innovation, like what is the purpose? Claire, you raised this, I guess this was in Dean Liu's introduction, right? Just because we can, does that mean that we should? And there has to be, as Claire said, a compelling reason to invest, to engage, to work with these technologies. And it's really easy for us in the current context to imagine compelling people to provide their biological material, or generating babies for the sake of people who can pay for and desire babies, to otherwise restrict reproductive rights using these technologies. And it's really difficult for us to imagine liberatory possibilities, or at least it is for me. I feel like such a cynic when I talk about these things. And so, Susan, I see your question. I'm trying to imagine this. It feels, I feel like I reference The Handmaid's Tale 30 times a day. It happens a lot in my life. It's easy to imagine ectogenesis being mandated with abortion being completely outlawed. I don't think it's a difficult future, particularly given the state of science fiction, but also the state of changes to laws around the world, and particularly in the United States occurring. So as we move forward with really advanced, highly expensive technologies, including human genome editing, which I like to bring up all of the time, but also ectogenesis, what is the compelling reason? What problem are we trying to solve here? And if the problem we're trying to solve is reducing prematurity, there are a lot of other ways that we can be doing that first, before we need to think substantively about ectogenesis. And if it's women's liberation, I have thousands of other ideas that we could engage in first.
Thank you. Claire, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I just only to say that I agree. I think, I did look at the US context a bit in the book, and in my PhD as well. And I think one of the things, Alana, you referenced The Handmaid's Tale, and it's also like, we can just look at the existing laws and policies in the US, right? On compelling pregnant people who have trace amounts of alcohol or drugs in their systems to be involuntarily incarcerated. So this stuff is very much already happening. And I think this is, again, why I think that looking at the existing legal and political context is so important, because I think I understand your point, Alana, about kind of feeling like a cynic, but it's impossible to take the imagination beyond the incredibly cruel ways that the law is coming down on pregnant people and in many parts of the world. And I think in the US, artificial wombs were actually referenced in Dobbs, in the court case that helped to disintegrate Roe v. Wade. And so I think it's actually not that far from plausible that the technology could be used in this way to undermine abortion rights. And I think there's also there's in terms of the kinds of like campaigns that are happening around abortion, we have had the technology for so long for people to be able to terminate their pregnancies on their own terms in their own homes. Like the medication abortion is the technology, right? But it's not like it's actually being like access is actually being enabled. And I guess to that point as well, the place where I see the kind of what's the word, where I see that sort of inspiration, where I can believe in a better future. And this is so my supervisor at DAL, Joanna Erdman, does a lot of work around medication abortion. So, and the place where there is this real promise is activists and community workers on the ground who are getting these medications to people and in defiance of an unjust law. And so I think that perhaps like in terms of dreaming of like, what can the future look like? The place where you can actually find the capacity for imagining that the future could be better and that we could actually have this future where maybe technologies could be used in empowering ways is sort of looking to that work.
It's amazing. There may be no other technology in which the disparity between the tech development community and the innovation community and the people most implicated and impacted are so incredibly disparate, and the context so ridiculously different. I don't know, Alana, you're going to disagree with that?
I was thinking about like so many pharmaceutical interventions, pretty much anything to do with women's reproductive health. Like that's the conversation I'm having all of the time. And pretty much anything to do with women's reproductive health and relevant innovations, unless being developed by groups of women, tend to be all about disparity. How can we maximize this? And, I feel like we could talk about the speculum here. Like there's the development and the execution are two different things.
Yeah.
So.
No, absolutely.
Just to add on to that conversation, just thinking about the mistrust around reproduction for people of color, Black people and Indigenous people in this part of the world, already there's a huge mistrust in the reproductive space. And I think I can say the same for most spaces where, that the racism does impact the high mortality rates for Black women in the US when they do decide to go and deliver. And so in that respect, by moving to artificial wombs, we are further medicalizing an institution that is already unjust, to these communities. And so even if access was an option, Claire, to your point, would these communities be willing to use those services? Because now all the way from gestation to the birthing of that child, it's in someone else's hands, someone who they likely do not trust, right? So back to that point, unless we deal with the root issues, these technologies are only going to benefit certain communities, because even if you make it free, even if you make it accessible, if these communities are continuously discriminated against, impacted by those exact institutions, they will not want anything to do with it. And what's not for them to imagine, what are you going to do with their fetuses in those institutions? How are parents down the road, when these children are born, how are they going to assume that maybe this child has autism or has this condition simply because they are born with it, versus this process has somehow made them have this disease or condition, right? Because now it's completely controlled by someone else.
There are so many good questions. Do you have your Q&As open, Claire and Margaret?
Yeah, please.
I feel like there's so many good ones that we should take on.
Please pick and choose as you see fit.
I want to respond to Hal's question, but then I was like, the last one by the anonymous attendee, Margaret, that's for you. And the first one is like, has Claire all over it. So Claire, did you want to start with that one before
which one?
the fertility technologies and medical insurance? you see that one by Cameron Shelley?
I can read it out to you, Claire. Fertility technology has sometimes been promoted by insurance plans. For example, egg freezing as a perk in employee health plans. How might medical insurance figure into dissemination of ectogenesis? I wonder if this is something you've come across, Claire, in your work.
Yeah, I think this goes back a little bit to the Musk kind of conversation. And I'm sure actually Alana and Margaret, you probably have potentially more to say about this than I do, but I think that kind of framing of again, it goes back to that framing of choice. So this idea of like, for perhaps your company could pay for you to use an artificial womb, and then you could keep working. Wouldn't that be great? You don't have to take any time off for pregnancy, and we don't have to provide any kind of parental leave. In fact, we'll provide you with even less parental leave than we already do. So that is kind of how I see that one potentially playing out.
Yeah, egg freezing insurance is like simultaneously lauded as being amazing and also requires entirely healthy people, young women generally, to go through an invasive intervention exposed to high levels of hormones that aren't without risk. It's not the riskiest procedure ever, but it does involve some risk, and there are side effects that might occur. To freeze their eggs to then come back to use them when they are ready, undergoing in vitro fertilization, and the risks associated with carrying a pregnancy later. Like to frame these as liberatory interventions that might be helpful as an employee perk, really rethinks who's taking risks around pregnancy and who is accountable for the time and space and physicality of it. So I don't think it's entirely problematic, but I think that there are many problems associated with that kind of medical insurance that assume the shifting around of the labor of reproduction.
Now, Alana, because you just mentioned health insurance and healthy young women, I want to bring up the issue of gender politics here a little bit, and the question of non-binary people that you've all encountered, possibly encountered in your research, and discourses around that. If you want to discuss it, I'm opening that up, but I think there'd be people who'd be interested in hearing what kinds of conversations are happening around in queer communities, for example, around the question of ectogenesis, if you've encountered them.
Maybe I'll go first because this is a community. I work with trans and gender diverse people in Saskatchewan on access to care, including to a lesser extent reproductive care, but this factors prominently in my research. Conversations around ectogenesis are not something that are generally occurring because it doesn't exist. This is something that happens a lot related to surrogacy though, right? Taking pregnancy outside of, or the carrying of a pregnancy outside of the people who are intended to be parents, which ectogenesis also does. But there are many questions about who that's available to and under what circumstances. And for the most part, it's extremely wealthy people or relatively wealthy people or people willing to go into substantial debt in order to engage this way. So the questions of resource allocation here remain part of that conversation. It depends on who has the capacity to carry a pregnancy. And I think some of these conversations are really stressing the importance of geneticization, right? The emphasis we put on having genetically related offspring. And that is one kind of family, but it's not the only kind of family. And stressing that we need to have biologically related children again and again, that's the kind of family that we should prioritize, that we should engage and invest in these kinds of technologies to do so, I think undermines the creativity that many people engage in the kinds of families that they build.
Claire, did you want to add anything to that, or Margaret?
Margaret, did you have anything that you wanted to add? No.
Okay.
The only thing that I would sort of say in addition to what Alana has already said is that again, this idea does come up that artificial wombs could allow people of all genders to have pregnancies in this kind of alternative way. And I do think that if I'm sitting and speculating, what could we have with this technology in a different kind of world, then that is compelling to me. But I think what we've been saying in this conversation is that we don't have that world. We wish we did. And in fact, you get a lot of stuff in the feminist literature that's like, this could allow men to be pregnant, but men already can be pregnant, right? So it's actually about, to me, it's about dismantling the kinds of laws and policies that stigmatize against people who aren't cis women carrying pregnancies, and looking at all of the kinds of ways that we have under existing circumstances the ability to support people to build families of their choosing.
Yeah, exactly. So it always comes back down to reproductive justice and questions of access in every case. I do, we have about 10 minutes left. We don't have to go to full time. I do have one question because it's based on conversations that we've already had in this small group. And that is the other technologies surrounding, this is about ectogenesis, but we've talked about the speculum, we've talked about abortive technologies, abortion tech, low tech as well. What other high tech kinds of questions come into play when we're talking about reproductive technology? Alana, you talked about DNA testing earlier. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit now about other types of tech beyond ectogenesis and beyond even reproductive technologies that are within the spectrum of reproductive tech, but we haven't really talked about yet. Do any of you have anything to say about that? I hope so, because I just asked a really long question. So.
I was going to just totally ignore Marcel's question and then talk about what amazing questions there are in the chat. So good. But Claire, were you going to answer it? Also, it's a good question, Marcel. I didn't mean to suggest that it wasn't. There's so many other good ones too.
It's a really good question. I only was going to draw it back to what's going on with the existing research teams that are working on artificial womb technology. I think that there's a lot of collaborations happening there across various different areas of tech. So for instance, there's one group that's working on a computer modeling system to kind of track the different needs of individual fetuses. And there's also been discussion of using technologies to genetically assess or try to determine which patients are at risk of preterm birth. And I think that both of those things to me present a whole slew of interrelated ethical questions, including some of the things that we've touched on.
Okay, I'm going to drop my question. And we do have this question about access. How do we feel about the argument that if everyone can't access something, no one should? The concern of unequal access seems to say this, and then Heather Love follows up with a question about this as well. And I wonder if you wanted to weigh in on this idea as well. It's not just a question of if everyone can access it, no one should, but also about should it be developed in the first place. So
we could also add Stephen Wilkinson's question to this too, who asks, sometimes technologies that are expensive in the first place get cheaper over time. And so it's important to also consider the possibility that this might at some point be a relatively accessible technology.
I think my contribution to that question would be that I would not say no to these technologies being developed because they are people who can benefit from it. The concern is how they will be used in the end by different interested parties. It could be, and I think Claire opened with this, that it's neither good or bad. It's in who has this technology in their hands is the one who can decide whether it is good or bad. So if you think about how current technologies are being used, IVF is an example. It's neither good or bad, but how is it being used? Who has access to it? I think that's the major concern here. So if it's affordable, great. If it's accessible, great. how are we using it though, is the question. I think someone also did ask, thinking about the rights of the children born out of this technology. And I think that's a very important question, because when I think on the other side for children born through this technology, I'm thinking the connection, the human connection is going to be very severely impacted by using artificial wombs. As a woman or a person who can carry a child, you have 9 months of bonding that you establish with that child. And we don't know yet what the impact of those 9 months are on, regarding to the question on mothering, what happens in those 9 months that forms you as a mother. And so, for instance, in surrogacy, what we've seen is that women would sign up for a surrogate and never show up, like the exploitation of surrogacy in India, where people did come and use surrogates and in the end never picked up their children. So I'm thinking in a scenario where you have artificial wombs and someone just has their embryo out there for 9 months or so and decides that I don't want this child anymore. What then happens in that scenario? Because they're not as intrinsically engaged with that process as it currently is. And I'll stop.
I want to jump on that point, Margaret, because oh, yes, exactly. Like, I think one of the things that frustrates me in a lot of the general discussion of artificial wombs is that it is presented, it's often talked about as like, oh, it's an alternative to pregnancy. And no, it's potentially an alternative form of gestation. It's not pregnancy. Pregnancy is something that mammals do. And when I was writing the book and I was increasingly more and more pregnant with my baby, I just kept thinking about all of these little minute interactions between me and this very wanted fetus, and like what that sort of meant. And there are ways that, some of the research aims to replicate the relational aspects of pregnancy through such things as like playing the sound of a maternal heartbeat or playing the voice of the parents. And yes, that is like a feature that is aimed to be relational, but I don't think that there is I can't quite imagine a scenario where the full relationship of a pregnant person carrying a baby can be replicated in a technology. And also to that point on the consent of the child, I had some really interesting conversations when I was working on the book about adult adoptees in the United States, and this the idea of like kind of a right to know your origin. And when we think about, again, this is like the further future of ectogenesis, if it did become this alternative form of gestation, what does that actually mean to those babies that are born of technology? Not only in terms of like this possibility that Margaret raises of what if people did not come for these children, but what if we're imagining this scenario? One of the key arguments to me against the whole artificial womb instead of abortion idea, if we want to dismiss or set aside the feminist disputes against it for a moment, but who is taking these babies that are being removed against the will of the pregnant person? Yes, I will also leave it.
I just wanted to add to that we, in the case of reproductive technologies like gamete donation, there is a cadre of children, not children, adults, who have been born over time, who've articulated certain concerns about commercialization, about the right to know their genetic origins, as Claire was just mentioning with adoption. And there are many children born of surrogacy, some of whom have participated in some of these discussions, but there is not a lot of focus. And I'm so glad that this has been articulated in the chat and in the questions and in the answers to the questions about the voice and position of people born this way, because in the governance of reproductive technologies, that's a voice that we don't hear very often, despite those being the most important people affected by those technologies. And this addresses a question that Cynthia White has put in the chat also about potential legal complications when there's transnational movement of embryos and ectogenesis. We see this with embryo donation, with gamete donation, with surrogacy, that there are concerns about citizenship and movement and statelessness and who's responsible for children conceived in these terms. And so I think that that's something also to consider, is what about transnational mobility of families looking to use ectogenesis in a place where it is available versus a place where it's not available if the technology ever comes to fruition? Not that I have the answers to those questions, but.
I think this is in part why I asked the question earlier. Alana, you inspired it when you're speaking about genetic testing and blockchain and so on, and those kinds of technologies, how they are embroiled in this process as well, in the entire process. And we don't have to answer that question, but that's why I was asking that question. I think it is relevant. We have about 3 minutes left. Does anyone want to talk about ChatGPT? It just seems way more important right now. I'm kidding. That's my sense of humor. Sorry, I'll stop. Does anyone have any kind of parting words to say, or if you want to address any of the questions that are out there coming from the audience?
Marcel, to your question around technologies, one that's really been interesting for us is around sex selection, which is pre-implantation genetic testing. And this technology was initially put out there to say that it will help people with genetic conditions be able to weave those out so that they have healthy children. And then it was adopted in certain contexts to identify male presenting embryos and prioritize those over female presenting embryos in contexts where male children are highly regarded. So it goes back to the point of these technologies will be interpreted based on the context and what is of priority in those contexts. There is no technology that's neutral. It will always be adopted by, whatever that context dictates is, good versus not good. And so that's my only addition to that.
Well, I think that really, it also answers the question about the designer baby question, which, with the increasing medicalization of childbirth, there is this context created for control and for design. And I think what you just stated there speaks to that. Alana and Claire, did you have any last words?
Claire, I'm going to go really quickly so you can have the last word. I just want to say that I think that there's a increasing commitment to finding biotechnological solutions for things we have the answers to. This isn't a technology I'm inherently opposed to, but I think that we have a lot of solutions to, again, women's liberation, also to addressing preterm birth. Like we know a lot of things what to do, but we don't do them because we're committed to more and more innovative solutions. And so I think that we can look to those answers first, while pursuing research in a theoretical way. I'm not committed to ectogenesis yet, but maybe I'll be convinced.
Claire?
It's really hard to follow both of your comments. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think we have the solutions to many of these problems at our fingertips. There are people that have been doing the work on the ground for a long, long time that could use the funds that are being poured into biotechnologies. And I guess the last sort of bit that I would kind of add as the caveat to that is that when such research has already been funded, and I mentioned this in the talk, I think it also behooves us to think about how we can have productive conversations about ethics and justice within the context of work that is already happening.
It's great. And I think a great place to end off that there's really nothing technological about this talk in some ways. So I want to thank all of our speakers. This is a fantastic panel. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today. If you can give, do some virtual applause for these people. I'm sure it would be thunderous. Thank you so much for your time. There will be a recording of this event, and it will appear on the Critical Tech Talk site and the Critical Media Lab website. And please pass the word about this talk. It was fantastic. And thanks again. And Margaret, good luck with your defense this week. We hope that goes really well. And Claire, thanks again for joining us. And Alana, you too, right here on campus. So thanks so much, everyone, and have a good night.